And now it is my privilege and honor to introduce Robert Kennedy.
On a hot August night in 1964, Robert F. Kennedy mounted the podium at the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City.
It was first a rumble and then a roar, and pretty soon it just consumed the whole place, and they would not stop. They simply would not stop. I don't know, 15, 16, 17, 18 minutes, I don't remember how long it was. I only remember that I couldn't stop crying.
It didn't surprise me that they would not let him speak, not let him, not let go of him. He was the representation of what they had lost. And if the delegates had a sense of loss, imagine what his feelings were. Every day, every hour, every minute, he felt the loss of his brother.
10 months before, President John Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. Bobby had given his life to his brother as confidant, protector, lightning rod. Now his brother was gone, and he was left to carry on alone.
He was not really built for the spotlight. He was built for the wings. He had to fight against a basic shyness, a basic nervousness in public. Many times I would stand behind the stage and I would see his leg shaking during a speech or his hand shaking. He wasn't unnatural. But that all had to change when his brother was assassinated. And I think change is the motif of his whole life and career.
He really becomes something much larger than what he was when he began. He becomes stronger through suffering.
The pandemonium went on for 22 long minutes. As the crowd grew quiet, he bared his grief, enshrining his brother in words from Romeo and Juliet.
When I think of President Kennedy, I think of what Shakespeare said in Romeo and Juliet, when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he shall make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun.
When he was finished speaking, he left the hall, sat on a fire escape, and wept. In the spring of 1952, Massachusetts Congressman John Kennedy was keeping up a brave face while his campaign for the United States Senate unraveled into chaos. He desperately needed a tough, disciplined campaign manager. As he would for the rest of his life, he reached out to his kid brother. Bobby didn't want to do it. He already had a job, working as a lawyer in the Justice Department. But Robert F. Kennedy knew what his family expected. For the next 12 years, he would devote himself to Jack, putting his brother's ambitions before his own. That had been the great lesson of his childhood. As the third boy and the seventh of 9 children, Bobby Kennedy easily got lost. He was born in Brookline, Massachusetts, on November 20th, 1925, All through his early years, he struggled just to keep up.
Everything was a competition, within the family and without. They still talk, this little yacht club in Hyannis, about how the Kennedys cheated by adding more sailcloth to their boats. The Kennedys were very competitive, and they wanted to win at everything they did.
"We don't want any losers around here," Joseph Kennedy told all his children. "In this family, we want winners. Don't come in second or third, that doesn't count. Win." Bobby's father was the towering figure in his childhood. Joseph P. Kennedy had made millions with shrewd investments in the stock market, the movies, and some say, by bootlegging liquor. But he wanted more out of life than money. He wanted his two oldest sons, Joe Jr. and Jack, to win elected office. And even more, he wanted Joe Jr. to become president someday.
This would give the family a kind of visibility, a kind of cachet, a kind of social status that Joe Kennedy was very hungry for. And the children imbibed this ambition.
While Joe's attention was lavished on his two oldest boys, Bobby quietly took his place among the younger children, the girls. He was small, awkward, shy. His father described him as the family runt. He would set out to prove he was as tough as his brothers. When he was only 4, he dove off the family sailboat in a desperate attempt to prove he could swim ashore. As he was going under, Joe Jr. had to haul him out. It either showed a lot of guts, Jack said later, or no sense at all.
And that's how Bobby got his father's attention, by being the tough guy. But beneath that toughness, there was always the softness and the sensitivity. He was a mama's boy. In fact, his grandmother worried that he was too much of a sissy, too much of a girly boy, because he clung to his mother's skirts.
Rose Kennedy was a devout Catholic, and Bobby absorbed her religious intensity. He made his first communion when he was 7, and went on to become an altar boy and attend a school run by Benedictine monks. Bobby Kennedy grew up with a strong sense of right and wrong, good and evil. Like his brothers, he was toughened by the rigorous demands of his father, but he disguised as well a gentler nature. Bobby, a friend said, was truly in touch with his emotions. He was saved by being overlooked. When World War II began, Bobby was in high school and chafed to get into the action, like his two older brothers. He flushed with pride when Jack became a hero, rescuing most of his crew after his PT boat was sliced in two by a Japanese destroyer. But disaster was to follow and determine the direction of Bobby's life. In the summer of 1944, Joe Jr. volunteered for a near-suicidal mission to pilot a plane loaded with dynamite toward an enemy target and then parachute to safety. His plane exploded before he ever got there. Joe Jr. was dead, along with all the hopes his father had invested in him. Now it would be up to Jack to realize his father's ambitions, and it would become Bobby's role to help him. But Bobby was young, only 18, still struggling to determine his own destiny. In 1948, he graduated from Harvard, went on to law school, and then became the first of the Kennedy boys to settle down. 24 years old, he married Ethel Skakel, wealthy, outgoing, athletic, so devout she had almost become a nun. A year later, the first of his 11 children was born. When it came to those he loved, Bobby was tender, maternal. But he turned a hardened face to the world.
He was particularly edgy and volatile, and I think unhappy when he was in his early 20s. He was an angry young man. I mean, he was always getting into fistfights. I mean, his temper was about that far from the surface.
In 1952, when he managed his brother's victorious run for the Senate, Robert Kennedy gained a reputation as ruthless, a rude, arrogant, impatient kid. But he shrugged off complaints. "I don't care if anyone around here likes me," Bobby said, "as long as they like Jack." Now, with Jack in the Senate, Bobby would darken his reputation further when his father got him a job with a family friend, one of the most controversial men in America, Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy.
Any man who has been given the honor of being promoted to general and who says, "I will protect another general who protects communists," is not fit to wear that uniform, General.
In 1953, Bobby enlisted in McCarthy's crusade against what both men saw as the evil of communism in America.
Robert Kennedy in the 1950s was very much his father's son. His father was fiercely anti-communist. Joe Kennedy saw Joe McCarthy as doing the Lord's work.
History thinks of Joe McCarthy as this virulent red baiter, but Bobby Kennedy was a black and white moralist at this stage of his life. And the communists were the bad guys, and anybody who was against the communists was therefore a good guy. And so he liked the kind of black and white morality that Joe McCarthy was selling.
What was striking about Bobby was not that he worked for Joe McCarthy so much, but rather that he admired Joe McCarthy and became very close to Joe McCarthy. So when McCarthy was conducting his investigations into suspected communists, Bobby enthusiastically joined in this role.
Bobby worked for McCarthy for 6 months, then moved on, still grimly determined to root out evil in America.
I decline to answer this question on the grounds that the answer may tend to incriminate.
I decline the answer on the ground. The answer I'll be incriminating myself.
Somebody that's been as successful as you can remember how to say, "I decline to answer a question," so don't put that act on.
I want to make sure.
Yeah.
As chief legal counsel for what became known as the Senate Rackets Committee, Bobby began probing into labor unions and mobsters, grilling some of the toughest gangsters in America. But no one rankled him more than Jimmy Hoffa. Hoffa was president of the Brotherhood of Teamsters, the country's largest, richest, and one of its most corrupt unions. Bobby said he detected in Hoffa absolute evilness.
Did you say anything to the effect that the jury treated you very well, and that you thought that you could do very well before a jury?
I know that's pretty ridiculous.
Did you say anything like that?
I did not. And I appeal to the chair that that be taken out of the record.
Bobby turned his investigation of Hoffa into a holy cause, holding hearings month after month and calling more than 1,500 witnesses. Punishing Hoffa became a crusade.
You've got people in Detroit, at least 15 who have police records. You've got Joey Glimko in Chicago. I say you're not tough enough to get rid of these people then.
But Hoffa was contemptuous. He denied any wrongdoing, taunting the crusading young investigator.
Did you say, "That SOB, I'll break his back"?
Who?
You.
Say to who?
To anyone.
Figure of speech, I don't even know who I was talking about, and I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, Mr. Hoffa, all I'm trying to find out, I'll tell you what I'm talking about. I'm trying to find out whose back you were going to break.
Figure of speech. Figure of speech.
I used to love, Hoffa said, to bug the little bastard. Bobby could never bring Hoffa down, but his zealous efforts won him the attention of the nation's press, much to the delight of his brother Jack, who was a member of the Senate Rackets Committee, too. "Two boyish young men from Boston," wrote a reporter in Look magazine, have become hot tourist attractions in Washington. The Kennedys' fabulous wealth, their marriages, their glamour, all made them favorites of the picture magazines. I think he found himself during the Hoffa investigation, a friend said. For the first time in his life, Bobby was happy. But in September 1959, Bobby resigned from the Senate Rackets Committee where he had made his mark. His brother was running for president. When Jack set out to win the Democratic nomination, Bobby once again put his own ambitions aside. He would do whatever it took to get his brother elected. While Jack rose above the fray, Bobby took on the gritty day-to-day business of running the campaign, pushing his staffers to their limits, attacking Jack's opponents, becoming the campaign's dark driving force. As one journalist put it, whenever you see Bobby Kennedy in public with his brother, he looks as though he showed up for a rumble. By the time the Democrats met for their convention in Los Angeles, Kennedy seemed to have the nomination wrapped up. But Lyndon Johnson, the powerful Senate Majority Leader from Texas, set out to stop him.
The person you select is your president. His judgment, the responsibilities he's shouldered, the weight he's carried, the burdens he knows, the decision he makes may well determine whether you live as free men.
LBJ was one of America's smartest political operators. But Bobby outmaneuvered him, skillfully working the convention floor, making sure that LBJ didn't get the votes.
Mr. Chairman, Wyoming's vote will make majority for Senator Kennedy.
John Kennedy was nominated overwhelmingly on the first ballot. Now, all that was left was the choice for vice president. When he chose Lyndon Johnson, he set into motion a sequence of events that left Bobby and LBJ smoldering with resentments that would never go away. From the very first, LBJ and Bobby detested each other. It was, as Johnson politely described it, a matter of chemistry.
It was just oil and water. Bobby was very moralistic. Integrity meant everything to him. And LBJ was a politician.
Robert Kennedy spoke the word politician as if it were an obscenity. He hated the backslapping, log rolling, all of the horse trading of politics, the sort of thing that Lyndon Johnson absolutely loved.
Bobby dislikes Johnson intensely, but Jack Kennedy is calling the shots. And what Jack Kennedy understands is that as a Northeastern Irish Catholic, he needs very much to get Southern votes. And so it becomes essential to bring someone like Lyndon Johnson onto the ticket. But once they let out the word that they're going to make Lyndon Johnson the vice presidential nominee, Labor and liberals in the party throw a fit.
Bobby is charged by his brother with the responsibility of talking Johnson off the ticket.
Bobby confronted Johnson in his hotel room and told him flatly that JFK no longer wanted him to be the vice presidential nominee. LBJ didn't believe him. Insulted, he refused to quit.
Johnson wants to be vice president. He's not going to back down. He's not going to give up. And he thinks that Bobby is operating without Jack's approval.
Bobby's been out of touch, Jack leaked to a reporter. He doesn't know what's happening.
Bobby is absolutely taking the fall for his brother here, and that suits John Kennedy perfectly well. And Johnson has fallen for this head fake But it is absolutely inconceivable to anybody who knew the Kennedy brothers that Robert Kennedy would be acting on his own to split up his brother's presidential ticket within hours of the deal being sealed.
And I am grateful, finally, that I can rely in the coming months on many others, on a distinguished running mate who brings unity and strength to our platform and our ticket, Lyndon Johnson.
Lyndon Johnson will never forgive Robert Kennedy for this. The manner of the selection of Lyndon Johnson as vice president severed the relationship between the two of them permanently, and there would be no turning back. For the rest of his life, Johnson will say that John Kennedy offered me the vice presidency, and in the dark of night, Bobby Kennedy came downstairs to try to take it away from me.
The election of 1960 was too close to call. JFK won by only 120,000 votes. As one Kennedy aide described it, a gnat's eyebrow. Bobby had driven himself relentlessly, and JFK was forever grateful. He's the hardest worker, he's the greatest organizer, President John Kennedy said. Easily the best man I've ever seen. As JFK prepared to assume the reins of power, he wanted Bobby by his side and appointed his 35-year-old brother Attorney General.
It was a controversial appointment. He had never been a lawyer in a courtroom. And it was nepotism. I mean, he was the brother of the president.
His experience was zero. He'd been a lawyer for Senate committees, a zealot with no understanding of the terrible responsibilities of an attorney general. I was appalled. I thought it was a simply awful idea.
Bobby surprised everyone, moving quickly to show he was more than just the president's brother.
There are a number of different areas and where action is needed. I think that in the field of organized crime, I think it's a very serious situation that's facing the country at the present time.
Within 2 weeks of taking office, he became the first attorney general ever to declare war on crime. He proved a hard, tireless worker, and his casual, freewheeling style was a striking departure from the formality of bureaucratic Washington.
He was unlike any other attorney general I've known. He wandered around in his shirt sleeves. He had his big, huge dog, Brumus, in his office. The kids came in, the children's drawings were on the wall.
If you saw Bob Kennedy in a tie at his office, it would be way down open. His office was a place of constant motion and doing things unexpected, breaking the schedule. He was not a sit-behind-your-desk man.
But just 3 months after Bobby had started his new job, he received an urgent summons to the Oval Office. The president was face to face with disaster. JFK had gone along with a CIA plan to invade Cuba with a small army of Cuban exiles. The president had been assured that the Cuban people would rise up against the communist government of Fidel Castro and revolt. But the CIA had been wrong. Bobby watched helplessly as his brother wrestled with catastrophe. The invaders were under attack. Castro's army was taking prisoners. "They can't do this to you," Bobby said. But the invasion failed. JFK had fumbled badly. Now, the president would turn to his brother for advice and counsel, as he never had before.
Traditionally, attorneys general have nothing to do with foreign policy. But after the Bay of Pigs, John Kennedy really wanted Bobby by his side, helping him to make the decisions on everything. Because there was only one person in the world that John Kennedy trusted unequivocally, and that was Robert Kennedy.
I think that brought them much closer together than they had been earlier. There was, I think, a recognition for the first time by Jack on a need for Bobby rather than simply a use of Bobby.
You would think that after the Bay of Pigs, the lesson would be don't mess with Castro. Bobby's nature, however, was not when the yellow light was blinking to hit the brakes, but rather to hit the gas.
Castro became Bobby's obsession. Working closely with the CIA, Bobby launched a secret war against him, codenamed Operation Mongoose.
All kinds of things were tried, all kinds. Try to infiltrate the military, have a coup or a revolt, sabotage. He was pushing, always pushing. Bobby Kennedy wanted things blown up, so we blew things up.
Nothing was off limits. Between 1960 and 1965, the CIA made at least 8 separate attempts on Fidel Castro's life, but neither of the Kennedys was ever directly linked to any of them.
The orders I got were get rid of Castro, quote unquote. And I kept asking them, what do you mean by get rid of? Can you be a little bit more specific? What do you want to happen? What do you want to see as an end result? They said, we want him to disappear. And it's left up to you as a senior officer to decide what your limits are, if any.
My own conclusion is that Bobby never quite came out and said, you must kill this guy. You will never find good evidence. They didn't write it down. Joe Kennedy once said to Bobby, never write it down. Old Irish rule in Boston.
Bobby attempted to oust Castro for nearly 2 years, but his efforts only seemed to stiffen Cuban resolve.
Total waste of effort. I tried to tell him that at the time. We were not going to succeed. Fidel was going to be there, and he's going to stay there. But Bobby Kennedy didn't understand what his limits were. No matter what we told him, no matter what we tried to do, no matter how many people we put on the job, he was always screaming for more.
By the end of 1961, Bobby Kennedy was 36 years old and the father of 7 children. After a long day at the Justice Department, he returned home to a Civil War mansion just outside of Washington called Hickory Hill.
It was a household where there was constantly something going on. Bob was overloaded with work, but he always took time for those children.
There was a lot of physical affection. Saturday or Sunday, all the children would pile into my parents' beds and tickle each other, and it was called a tickle tumble. Well, of course, there were plenty of dogs, plenty of horses. My brother Bobby collected, reptiles. We had a coatimundi, hawks, falcons. It was a menagerie.
Hickory Hill was the center of Bobby's private world. To be invited to a Hickory Hill party signaled acceptance into an exclusive community of power and privilege.
Hickory Hill party was a weird mixture of kind of fraternity party and high-minded salon. And it was kind of a fun mix of both, because they did talk about serious issues. They had Hickory Hill seminars where they would bring in famous people to lecture about child development or juvenile crime or the future of the Cold War. At the same time, they're goofing around and they're playing charades. It was an odd mixture of high sophistication and childish hijinks. There was a childlike quality to Bobby Kennedy. Bobby was always asking what flavor ice cream you like, and his favorite was chocolate.
There were always plenty of games, including Bobby's favorite, touch football.
I really didn't like to play the Kennedy brand of touch football. The rules were crazy. They made up the rules as they went along, or they had their own rules. I played a couple of times, but I'd usually try to find something to do. You know, somebody had to make a phone call or have to go to the bathroom. They were so competitive with each other, it was no real fun to play.
When all the guests had gone home, Bobby and Ethel assembled their children for an evening ritual.
My mother and my father shared a belief that we are on Earth for a short period of time, and that we are actually children of God. We prayed every night that John Kennedy would be the best president ever, and that my father would be the best attorney general ever.
The Kennedy brothers were now a team. Jack needed his brother, and nowhere more than with a problem that had begun to tear the country apart: the struggle of African Americans for equal rights. In the spring of 1961, a group called the Freedom Riders set out to integrate bus stations across the South. In a little Alabama town called Anniston, an angry mob attacked them, burning their bus, beating them mercilessly.
The Freedom Ride was very dangerous. Just our very being, our very presence was very, very dangerous. During those days, it was impossible for a person of color to get on a bus in the South without being forced to go to the back of the bus or go to a waiting room marked colored waiting, or use restroom facility marked colored men, colored women. We wanted to bring down those signs.
The Freedom Riders were acting on their constitutional rights. Federal statute outlawed segregation in bus terminals used in interstate transportation. And as Attorney General, Robert Kennedy was obligated to enforce the law.
I didn't know a great deal about Robert Kennedy. I knew he was a brother of the President of the United States. I knew he was the Attorney General. I wanted him to intervene.
But Bobby was reluctant. The rage and resistance from white Southerners had taken him by surprise. "Before I became Attorney General," he admitted, "I won't say I lay awake at night worrying about civil rights."
I think he was slow and late in getting it about the civil rights movement. Robert Kennedy is saying what most of the establishment said in that period: it's a good idea, but it's the wrong time.
I don't think any of us going into the department, despite our views on civil rights, really appreciated how mean it was in the South and how dangerous it was. Bobby used to compare the discrimination against blacks to the No Irish Wanted. And, you know, that was a wrong comparison. One I think was actually resented by blacks, despite the fact that he meant it well.
They didn't know black people. They didn't know black pain. They were not comfortable with black people. So there was no reason to expect, I can say in retrospect, them to be wise and passionate about this.
The President and the Attorney General both realized that the civil rights issue was the hot rail in American politics. They had won an election by 100,000 votes. They didn't really command a working majority in Congress. It was very narrow on any issue. The Southern Democrats defecting would have meant the loss of any legislative agenda.
As the Freedom Riders traveled deeper into Alabama, Bobby, fearing more violence, was determined to stop them. "Tell them," he told the Special Deputy for Civil Rights, "to call it off."
He got on the phone and said, "Stop those Freedom Riders. The President's about to go to Vienna to meet Khrushchev. It's embarrassing us before the world. Stop it." They were underway. They were not a stoppable group.
Black people in the South had gotten a sense of their efficacy as people and as citizens.
And to have Bob Kennedy's Justice Department tell them what to do would have been taking a major step backward. Who are you going to listen to? Are you going to listen to the black people of the South, or are you going to listen to the kid from Massachusetts? Well, that's an easy answer.
Bob was angry that they were upsetting everything by doing this. He wanted the civil rights movement to focus on winning the right to vote, and he didn't like his more stately agenda being upset. But once it was upset, then Bobby went into action.
Desperate to find a way to protect the riders, frantically improvising, Bobby sent his aide, John Siegenthaler, to meet with Alabama Governor John Patterson.
I go in and sit down and I say, I'm from the Attorney General. These people have to be given safe conduct. He says, we can't protect them. I am telling you, it is impossible. All the people we've got in this state upset about this. I mean, of course people are violent. These people are coming here asking for a fight, and they're going to get a fight.
That evening, we stayed in the waiting room at the Greyhound bus station in Birmingham all night. And we kept hearing rumors that Robert Kennedy was trying to negotiate a way for us to leave Birmingham. He kept saying to people we had a right to travel.
I said, Governor, look, if you can't protect them, we don't have any choice. Either we got to have marshals come in and protect them, or troops come in and protect them. That's the last thing you want. The last thing, when he banged the table, he said, if marshals or troops come into Alabama, blood will run in the streets.
Siegenthaler and Patterson struck a deal. The Freedom Riders would have state protection. As they headed toward the Alabama capital in Montgomery, Bobby believed that they would be given safe passage.
It was so strange, it was eerie, frightening. It was so quiet, so peaceful. And the moment we arrived at the bus station, the very moment we started down the steps off of that bus, a mob came out of nowhere. And they beat and beat the reporters, and you saw blood everywhere. And then they turned on us. I was sitting ahead by a member of the mob with a wooden crate, and my seatmate was beaten so bad, and I found myself laying on a pool of blood.
And as I pulled up to the bus station, you could hear the screams. I just leaped out of the car, and at that moment they wheeled me around and said, two guys, and said, what do you think you're doing? I said, magic words, get back. I'm with the federal government. And as I turned back, they hit me with a pipe right here.
Robert Kennedy became educated in a real hurry. And I tell you the thing that sealed it for him, perhaps more than anything else, after John Siegenthaler was beaten, someone that he knew.
I think everything he thought the administration of justice and law enforcement was supposed to be about had been violated, that it was an outrage, that it was a stain on law enforcement to let that happen.
Frustrated by Southern officials, Bobby ordered the Interstate Commerce Commission to enforce the ban on segregation in public transportation.
All of those signs that said white waiting, colored waiting, white men, white women, colored women, those signs came tumbling down.
He began to understand civil rights in stages. Very few people who are in great positions of power actually go through real interior change. But Robert Kennedy really did change, and that change, I think, began around civil rights.
While civil rights protests and demonstrations continued, the Kennedy administration was faced with yet another crisis. On October 16, 1962, the president learned that the Soviet Union was deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba. capable of vaporizing American cities along the East Coast within minutes.
It is the most dangerous moment in all human history. Never before had two contending powers possessed between them the technical capacity to blow up the world.
As the president's advisors debated the American response, Bobby's first instinct was to lash out, pressing for airstrikes to destroy the bases, even for an invasion of the island itself.
On the first day, when they discover the missiles, all Bobby wants to do is stage a provocation and bomb Cuba. I mean, he's a complete and total hawk, but this is the significant part. He changes his mind.
After hours and hours of intense debate, Bobby began to reconsider. "We've talked for 15 years about the Russians making the first strike against us," he said, "and we'd never do that. Now, to do that to a small country, it's a hell of a burden to carry."
It's Robert Kennedy who makes the powerful moral argument that to invade Cuba would be to wage a Pearl Harbor in reverse, that America simply didn't do this. We simply didn't wage preemptive attacks. We didn't strike without warning.
This argument didn't carry the day, but it was an important argument, and it started to affect and slow down this rush to war.
"I was very much surprised by Bobby's performance," Undersecretary of State George Ball said. "I always had a feeling that Bobby had a much too simplistic position toward things. But he behaved quite differently during the Cuban Missile Crisis." The crisis lasted 13 days, until the Russians finally agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for a public American pledge not to invade Cuba, and a secret promise to withdraw American missiles from Turkey. Bobby had hardly slept, rarely gone home. An aide who walked into his office remarked, "Something is different in here." Bobby replied, "I'm older."
The thing that is hurting us most is the continued existence of segregation and discrimination. And we think we are rendering a great service to our nation. For this is not a struggle for ourselves alone. It is a struggle to save the soul of America.
While the Kennedys were confronting the Soviet Union, the civil rights movement had not gone away. Bobby was determined to help, but on his own terms. He was growing increasingly exasperated with the man who was emerging as the movement's most conspicuous and inspiring leader, Martin Luther King.
Tension between King and Bob Kennedy was inevitable. Here was an uncontrollable force, a moral force, a person who was as much his own man as Robert Kennedy was. Bob liked to, control his agenda, and King's business was to, overthrow people's agendas. King, I think, worried about Bobby. He worried that he wasn't morally committed enough. He didn't sense the passion in Bobby. On the other hand, he had great hope that Bobby's readiness to use power would be turned to civil rights. He had hope, but he worried.
On May 3rd, 1963, King sent nonviolent protesters into the streets of Birmingham to boycott the city's segregated businesses. As the Birmingham police used high-pressure hoses to disperse them, Bobby watched it all on television. Many of the protesters were children. He was furious, caught between a civil rights movement that refused to back down and the violent antagonism of the South.
That a police chief would set police dogs and fire hoses on people for demanding to be treated fairly in a department store, that was bound to hit at his moral core. The events entirely transformed Robert Kennedy. He started out thinking that it would be better if people would calm down, slow down, and let gradual improvement take place. Bobby learned that you couldn't wait, and that black people were entitled to the most elementary rights now.
That summer, Bobby urged his brother to put a civil rights bill before Congress that would put an end to segregation in public accommodations. But the president and his advisors hesitated.
If you put civil rights legislation before Congress, it was going to tie up the Congress for the best part of the next year. And that meant that whatever other programs you had were going to be put on the back burner. But Bobby convinced his brother that not only was it right, but for the first time it was possible. And that the president really has to take leadership on a moral issue.
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities. Whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated.
It was probably the first time in the history of our country that an American president would say that the question of civil rights, the question of race, was a moral issue. And he had the encouragement of Robert Kennedy to push him in this direction. Robert Kennedy was learning. He was growing. He said to me, "John, I now understand. The young people have educated me." And you can see it, you could feel it. And Robert Kennedy, during that period, became so convinced, not just as a politician, not just as the Attorney General, but as a human being, that it was time for there to be some major steps to end racial discrimination in America.
While Bobby increasingly empathized with the civil rights movement, that fall, he authorized a wiretap on Martin Luther King, at the request of one of the most powerful figures in Washington. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover hated King, insisted that King was a communist threat, and placed him under close surveillance. Bobby acquiesced. If there were communists in the civil rights movement, he wanted to know about it. But there was another reason. Bobby was afraid of Hoover, not for himself, but for his brother.
Jack was a promiscuous guy who took great pleasure in having a lot of women around him, and he was careless about this after he became president, almost to the point of recklessness.
Bobby knew that Hoover was a blackmail artist. He knew that Hoover had files on his brother. Hoover had heard that Bobby wanted to fire him, and he wanted to use President Kennedy's sexual habits to essentially blackmail the administration to make sure that he kept his job.
There's no question Bob regretted that he had authorized the wiretapping of King, but Hoover was somebody that everybody was intimidated by.
If Hoover ever released any of the information he had, allowed it to be known, what would happen to the Kennedy presidency?
On November 20th, 1963, Bobby celebrated his 38th birthday at a party at Hickory Hill. The president stopped by to wish him well. He was about to leave for a political trip to Dallas. He said he was looking forward to it. Already, the brothers were thinking about the next election and the opportunities a second term would give them. 3 years of intense collaboration had bound them so closely together. Each seemed to know what the other was thinking.
No sooner did one of them begin a sentence than the other knew what he was saying. They understood each other so well that they talked in a kind of shorthand.
Well, everybody was having a good time. It was a birthday party, and the president stopped by. The motorcade came up, and he came in and shook hands, and it didn't stay very long, as I remember. Then he was off to Dallas, I guess, the next day.
Bobby would never see his brother again. On the afternoon of November 22nd, 1963, Robert Kennedy received a phone call from J. Edgar Hoover. "I have news for you," Hoover said. "The president's been shot." 30 minutes later, the phone rang again. Bobby's brother was dead. On November 24th, 1963, while the nation mourned a president, Robert Kennedy grieved for a brother to whom he had been devoted.
It was a physical blow to him, that loss of his brother. An emotional blow, intellectual blow, but it took a physical toll on him. He was physically in pain.
Enormous sadness and ache. It was there all the time. I never knew him when he wasn't in a kind of mourning for President Kennedy.
I was with Bobby, and I talked with him for a while. And it came time to go to bed, so I closed the door and I waited outside, and I heard him just sobbing. And he was saying, "Why? Why, God, why?"
I think that Bobby found himself bereft, alone, and the inheritor of not only a family ambition, but a national myth. When Jack died, Bobby was truly at a loss. He was deprived not only of a brother he loved, but in a sense of his own identity. Because to be the helper and be the servant and be the henchman could no longer be his identity. He had to forge some kind of identity for himself.
He didn't know who he was, or what he stood for, or what he was capable of. His brother's legacy was his to bear. Now, he would have to struggle to create a legacy of his own. It would have been difficult for Robert Kennedy to watch any man take his brother's place. But watching Lyndon Johnson was next to impossible.
All I have, I would have given gladly not to be standing here today.
The two men now rarely spoke of one another without contempt. Bobby described LBJ as mean, bitter, vicious. LBJ called Bobby a snot-nosed kid and a grandstanding little runt.
Johnson had particular contempt for the fact that Robert Kennedy had never run for office. He had never been elected to anything, and he saw him as a child of privilege, as someone who had never really earned the offices that he held. Whereas Lyndon Johnson had had to fight for it on his own and earned it in his own right.
LBJ moved quickly to assume the mantle of the fallen president. He convinced a reluctant Robert Kennedy, along with the rest of John Kennedy's cabinet, to stay on. Then swiftly began to push JFK's sputtering legislative program through Congress.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
The Kennedy legislative program was sitting on the Hill and not doing much of anything by the time of John Kennedy's assassination. Lyndon Johnson picks it up, infuses it with energy, gives it new meaning and new strength, and drives it through the Congress like only Lyndon Johnson can.
This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
One might expect Robert Kennedy to be pleased about the success of the Kennedy agenda.
But it was hard to be pleased with what LBJ was doing when it was LBJ doing it and not his brother.
He thinks of Johnson as a usurper, he thinks of Johnson as illegitimate, and it's painful for him to watch Johnson take these pieces of his brother's legacy and take ownership of his brother's legacy. It no longer belongs to his brother, it no longer belongs to him. It belongs to Lyndon Johnson.
While LBJ dominated the nation's politics, Bobby remained inconsolable. He was a haunted man, forever dwelling on his loss, as if cultivating the pain helped keep his brother's memory alive. He took to wearing his brother's old jacket, although he often forgot it somewhere, as if the jacket was at once a connection to his brother and a kind of burden he desperately wanted to leave behind.
Pain was etched on his face. He told me he couldn't sleep. He'd lost weight. He asked me how he looked. I said, "You look like hell." And he did.
He'd become, as in the Robert Frost poem that his brother also often loved to quote, acquainted with the night.
He and the president's widow often visited John Kennedy's grave, their shared sorrow drawing them closer together. When his faith in the Catholic Church could not alone sustain him, it was Jacqueline Kennedy who suggested he read the tragic dramas of the ancient Greeks. In agony, learn wisdom, he read in Aeschylus. Injustice is the nature of things.
Grief humanized him. I think it took him away from a life dedicated to power and will and ambition toward a deeper identification with people who suffered.
Slowly, Bobby emerged from his despair, reconnecting to the everyday world through politics and his need to carry forth the legacy of his brother.
Over the past few weeks, many leading members of the Democratic and the Liberal parties here in the state of New York have talked to me about being a candidate for the United States Senate.
On August 22nd, 1964, still wearing the black tie he had worn since his brother's death, Robert Kennedy announced that for the first time, he would run for political office.
I shall resign from the cabinet to campaign for election. I shall devote all of my effort and all whatever talents that I possess to the state of New York. This I pledge.
It is the biggest transition of his life to go from the shadows to the stage. And he had a fear, what if I lose? What if I let my brother down? What if I let my family down? What if I've made the wrong decision? What if I'm not ready to run for the Senate? He was still a wounded animal, half a zombie. He wasn't ready to face the voters.
The former Attorney General of the United States and candidate for the United States Senate from New York, Robert F. Kennedy.
He was still hurting and suffering.
Although voters turned out in large numbers, Bobby found it hard to accept their enthusiasm. They're cheering him, he said. They're for him.
He didn't want to trade on being his brother's brother. He didn't think that was right. At the same time, he didn't really have a series of things that I, Robert Kennedy, will do as the senator from the state of New York.
What about this tour of the Fulton Fish Market? What are your impressions?
Well, they have a lot of fish.
And it just didn't work very well.
I am very pleased and happy to have the opportunity to speak with all of you this morning.
He quickly fell behind in the polls. He was struggling to define himself and what he stood for.
I join Senator Bob Brownstein and Congressman Multa.
He has spoken for his brother, on behalf of his brother, for most of his political life. Suddenly he's a figure in his own right, but he can really only see himself as fulfilling his brother's legacy, doing what his brother would do if only his brother were still with us.
I think we started something 3.5 years ago. I think it was started January 1961, and I think this election is what we're going to keep it going.
He quoted his brother almost obsessively. He had a lot of the hand gestures of his brother.
And it was easy to believe for a minute, and you didn't have to close your eyes to do it, that John Kennedy was still with us.
And if we want to continue that effort, then we have to elect a Democratic administration.
Bobby was at war with himself, his need to emulate his brother, battling with his desire to find his own voice.
I think that this election's important, because I think that there's a lot that needs to be done. It's an intolerable situation, and it has to be changed. If I'm elected to the United States Senate, I intend to fight for that.
Despite the cheering crowds, as the campaign wound down, the election remained too close to call. Much to Kennedy's chagrin, there was only one man who could help him.
The United States needs a young, dynamic, compassionate, fighting liberal representing New York in the United States Senate, Bob Kennedy.
It had to stick in RFK's craw to have to accept anything from Lyndon Johnson.
Bobby had trouble hiding his distaste, but he was a pragmatist. LBJ may have hated Bobby, but he wanted a Democrat in the Senate. When all the votes were counted, LBJ had helped put Bobby over the top.
For all of us who are elected on this day, all of us now have a responsibility. Our job has just begun.
But even victory could not relieve his melancholy. If my brother was alive, Bobby told a friend, I wouldn't be here. I'd rather have it that way. That night, Bobby called LBJ to thank him for his help.
We got a lot to be thankful for, Bobby, and give our love to Ethel, and let's stay as close together as he'd want us to.
That'd be fine, Mr. President. Congratulations, though.
Tell all that staff of yours that ain't nobody going to divide us, and I'll tell mine the same way, and we'll move ahead, and I'm proud of you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for your help.
Thank you for calling.
Made a hell of a difference. Thanks.
Bobby Kennedy was never cut out to be a senator. He was used to making things happen, and the Senate's glacial pace irritated him.
He was the second most powerful man in the most powerful country in the world, and now he's a junior senator. He can't even get a seat on the Foreign Relations Committee. He used to run covert actions, and now he can't even go to the hearings. So he is a grumpy, cranky senator who won't sit through long-winded speeches and is disrespectful of other senators. He'll just get up and walk out.
Bobby, a friend said, felt impotent, frustrated, floundering. He escaped the Senate chambers as often as he could, channeling his restless energies elsewhere. 2 months after taking his seat in the Senate, he set out to scale a 14,000-foot mountain in Canada, recently named Mount Kennedy after his brother. No one had ever made it to the top before, and Robert Kennedy had never climbed a mountain before.
Bobby hated heights. He was afraid of heights. He didn't train for it, really. I mean, he joked that, as Ethel said, that he trained for it by running up and down the stairs yelling, help.
He was nearly 40 years old. Now, roped between two veteran climbers, Bobby forced his way forward, urging the others to increase the pace.
I think Robert Kennedy had a reckless streak in him. He was a ferocious competitor and with tremendous amount of aggression and will.
After 2 days of climbing, nearing the top, Bobby moved ahead and reached the summit alone. Kneeling down, he wedged his brother's inaugural address into the snow. For a moment, he stared off into the distance. "I didn't really enjoy any part of it," he said later. It was a daring exploit and a media sensation that would have delighted any politician. But American politics were about to take a darker turn. Bombs had begun to fall on a small, impoverished country in Southeast Asia. Lyndon Johnson began bombing North Vietnam in February 1965. He had inherited the war from Bobby's brother. Now, he was escalating it. With Vietnam divided into a communist North and an American-supported South, LBJ hoped that massive air assaults would force the North Vietnamese to abandon their efforts to reunite the country. But the North Vietnamese resisted. For the next 3 years, Robert Kennedy's fate would be increasingly bound to the outcome of a war on the other side of the world. Bobby had been committed to the war when his brother was president. Now that LBJ was in the White House, he continued to support its objectives. The loss of Vietnam, he told an aide, would mean the loss of all of Southeast Asia and have profound effects on our position throughout the world.
Bobby is a cold warrior. He shares the worldview that communism is a threat and it's advancing and that you have to contain it. So he doesn't question the underlying assumptions of the Vietnam War. He embraces them and endorses them.
But Robert Kennedy is deeply uneasy about Johnson's escalation of the war, really from the very beginning. He speaks to Johnson privately on the telephone, conversations that were recorded.
I have not been involved intimately with the Southeast Asia or Vietnam, but I would think that that war will never be won militarily, but where it's going to be won really is a political war. Military action obviously will have to be taken, but unless the political action is taken concurrently, in my judgment, I just don't think it can be successful.
I think that that's good thinking, and that's not any different from the way I have felt about it.
Johnson says that he agrees with Bobby Kennedy completely, and this is the sort of thing that Johnson probably believes when he's saying it, but it is not the course of U.S. policy.
All through the spring of 1965, Johnson continued to up the ante. He had already sent 75,000 American soldiers to Vietnam. That July, he sent 50,000 more. As the war drifted out of control, Bobby began to tentatively air his doubts in public.
May I ask you the direct question, do you support fully his present policy on Vietnam?
Well, I basically support the policy, Mr. Spivak. I have some reservations about whether we're doing enough in the economic and the political field, and I also have felt for some period of time that a major effort had to be undertaken in the diplomatic field.
Robert Kennedy believes that America needs to bring Ho Chi Minh to the table to negotiate. Johnson, meanwhile, is taking the opposite course, which is to escalate, to try to bomb Ho into submission.
For the rest of 1966, Bobby said little about the war. Instead, he turned his attention to problems at home. He would begin to speak out on behalf of the dispossessed, and as he reached out to them, he would transform his sense of himself. In the summer of 1965, riots in Watts, a poor African-American section of Los Angeles, left 34 people dead and more than 1,000 injured. Bobby was shaken.
He bumped into some reporter who asked him what he thought about, should these Negroes, as we called them then, be obeying the law? And he said, I don't know. He said, what did the law ever do for the Negro?
So I don't think that it's possible in our society and with our government to tolerate lawlessness and disorder and violence. But at the same time, I think that we've got to make more progress than we have in the past, be more effective with the programs that we've instituted, have some imagination to try to deal with the lack of hope that exists in many of these communities.
In a neighborhood in Brooklyn called Bedford-Stuyvesant, Bobby Kennedy meant to show the nation what could be done about poverty.
Bedford-Stuyvesant has got tremendous problems of unemployment, drugs, slum housing. And Robert Kennedy was an activist. He wanted to do something about it. He felt it was cheap grace to just make a speech and deplore poverty or racism and not do something about it.
And so he gets involved with the community leadership, and they plan together an initiative that will be not only about housing in the neighborhood, but about jobs and about public safety and about really trying to build a community there.
What we brought together for the first time really is the city, private foundations, the federal government, and I think most significant, the private sector.
When he went to the business people, he didn't say, I want you to give money. I want charity, because that's too easy. That just buys off. What he did was he said, I want investment here. I want you to run business here. I want you to hire people. I want you to make things here.
To have any success in Bedford-Stuyvesant is going to require the initiative and the imagination and the courage of the people who live in the community. The programs are going to have to be developed by the people who live in the community. I think outside...
He believed the core of any program had to be work and self-help and self-mastery. People had to have the wherewithal not to be defined by others, but to be able to define themselves. America's a very rich country. We could just hand out incomes. What he said was that would be profoundly destructive.
He hated welfare, but thought jobs were the solution, not just throwing people off the rolls. He had this empathy, seeing it from the point of view of what it would like to be a black child in a desperate situation with no jobs and no chance of college and broken family and drugs and gangs all around. I grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and I'll never forget one of the days we were going around Bed-Stuy, he said to me, I envy the fact you grew up in poverty and you grew up with black friends. And I said, well, what would have happened to you if you had grown up on this block instead of me? And he looks up and down the block at all of this, poverty and drug addiction and alcoholism. And he says, if I grew up here, I would have either become a juvenile delinquent or a revolutionary.
Robert Kennedy had begun to reach beyond the guarded politics of his brother. John Kennedy had always moved slowly, with caution. Now, Bobby was throwing caution to the wind. In March 1966, Kennedy flew to California, where his Senate subcommittee was investigating the causes of a strike by migrant grape pickers.
Robert Kennedy walks into the hearings, and the witness is this sheriff who is explaining to the committee how it is that he's arresting these demonstrators who are legally picketing.
If I have reason to believe that there's going to be a riot started and somebody tells me that there's going to be trouble if you don't stop them, then it's my duty to stop them.
Well, then you go out and arrest them?
Well, absolutely.
How can you go arrest somebody if they haven't violated the law?
They're ready to violate the law. In other words, Just like these labor people out here, they ask their attorney, what shall we do?
Could I suggest in the luncheon period of time that the sheriff and the district attorney read the Constitution of the United States?
Bobby declared his support for the grape strike, even joined a picket line. He was discovering there were causes he believed in, people he could fight for.
Kennedy took things personally. He saw somebody hurting and he hurt. He was so intense, so personal about somebody else's pain or injustice. And that's what made him a totally different kind of senator.
By the beginning of 1967, almost 400,000 Americans were fighting in Vietnam. More than 9,000 had been killed. More than 60,000 wounded. As the carnage continued, senators and congressmen from Lyndon Johnson's own party began to speak out against the war. But Bobby Kennedy still hesitated.
It took Kennedy a long time to decide he was going to oppose the Vietnam War. It was an agonizing process of indecision. He values courage above all other human qualities, and he realizes he's not displaying courage. He's not displaying leadership. But he was conflicted.
Not until February 1967 would Kennedy break decisively with the president, after a bitter confrontation in the White House.
Robert Kennedy takes a trip to Europe in January of 1967, and he comes back to find that there's a report in Newsweek that he has received an important peace feeler, as it was called, from the Vietnamese, that they are trying to send a plan for peace through him. Now, there's no truth to this whatsoever, but there it is in Newsweek.
And LBJ called and asked if we both could come to the White House, which we did. Johnson was in a foul mood, and he was embarrassed by it, and he was always prepared to think that anything that he was embarrassed by was something that Bobby had done. LBJ was just terrible. He was mean and nasty to Bobby. And Bobby was saying, I had nothing to do with this. I don't know of any peace feelers that were made. And Johnson believed none of it. And Bobby was just livid. He was so mad.
And Bobby comes back to his office and says, the president's unhinged. I mean, he was abusive and maybe just not mentally stable.
He told his aides that he would never again have anything to do with Lyndon Johnson, that the way he had been treated was so inexcusable that he could simply never have any real dealings with the man past that point.
A month later, Bobby rose in the Senate, condemned the morality of the war, and then admitted his own share of responsibility. I can testify, he said, that if fault is to be found, there is enough to go around for all, including myself.
He is the first politician of either party to take responsibility for what's happening in Vietnam. The first politician to accept blame, which gives a moral strength to the argument that he's making.
Do we have the right here in the United States to say that we're going to kill tens of thousands, make millions of people as we have, millions of people refugees, kill women and children as we have? I very seriously question whether we have that right. Now we're saying we're going to fight there so that we don't have to fight in Thailand, so that we don't have to fight on the west coast of the United States, so that they won't move across the Rockies. But do we, our whole moral position, it seems to me, changes tremendously.
Robert Kennedy in 1967 has come to question the basic assumptions of the war. He has begun to question whether we really do need to make a stand in Vietnam to protect that region from communism. He's come to question whether our national security interest in Vietnam is outweighed by the incredible human suffering that we're inflicting by waging war in this country. He's questioning the moral legitimacy of this war, which is something that he hasn't done to this point. He's confronted by new issues, and he grows in order to be able to face these challenges. He really learns from experience, and he really becomes something much larger than what he was when he began.
he becomes more and more thoughtful, more and more philosophical, more and more ready to accept that he does not have a monopoly on wisdom. That maybe this war in Vietnam was a fundamental mistake, and that maybe his brother would have gotten out.
Most people acquire certainties as they grow older. Bobby Kennedy discarded certainties. He grew. He started as this zealot, and he ended up as this man very sympathetic to those who were the despised and rejected of life.
Robert Kennedy was now reaching out to Americans everywhere who had been left behind. He had fully awakened from his dark night of mourning. The moral impulse to fight evil and do good that had always been a part of him was taking a new direction.
He wanted to know what life was like for someone else. He would ask, what do you feel? What do you think? He wanted to be inside the eyes of America's casualties. He wanted to see the world the way they saw it.
People believed in his understanding of their situation because he visibly was moved. He was someone who responded in the most graphic, human, emotional terms. He was somebody who bled, who was raw from the hurt done to others.
The hurt he felt from the assassination of his brother gave him that empathy for everyone else who hurt after that. I think he did begin to change incrementally while he was Attorney General before his brother was killed, but I think that all grew dramatically after his brother's murder, because then he identified with every other victim, anyone who was a casualty in life, he began to feel was his brother.
By 1967, America was in turmoil. Protesters against the war in Vietnam marched on Washington and bitterly attacked the president. With the election just 1 year away, they were desperate for someone to challenge him. Bobby Kennedy was besieged from all sides by people urging him to take on Johnson. But he hesitated, profoundly conflicted. "If I run," Bobby said, "I will go a long way toward proving everything that everybody who doesn't like me has said about me. That I've never accepted Lyndon Johnson as president. That I'm just a selfish, ambitious little SOB. I can't wait to get his hands on the White House."
He is absolutely tormented by this decision he has to make, either to support Johnson or to run for president.
I said to him, don't run. I said to him, you're not going to unseat Lyndon Johnson. He despises you. There's no way he's going to step aside if you get in. He'd love to take you to the convention and beat you. But he was caught in an emotional trap. It was as if inexorable forces were pushing him in the direction of running. And everything he was about in life was suddenly on the line.
He was tortured about it. I remember talking to him, and he suddenly, this gusher came out about his feelings about Johnson, and he said, I know he's president today because my brother nominated him for vice president. I know my brother is implicated in the beginning of the Vietnam War. For me to run against Johnson, I have to run against President Kennedy's judgment. And that was agonizing for Robert Kennedy, because in a way it would have meant running against the person he loved most in the world, his brother.
Isn't it true, people who believe that you are the real alternative to President Johnson are going to bring pressure upon you and increase their activities in your behalf?
I don't anticipate that will occur, but I'm going to continue as I said, and I'm not a candidate for the Democratic nomination.
Senator,
no matter what I do, I'm in difficulty.
Well, I wasn't trying to get you to say you were a candidate.
I know you
weren't.
But isn't that you say, isn't that what is going to happen? I suppose now all kinds of things can happen. I don't know what I can do to prevent that, or what I should do that is any different other than to try to get off the earth in some way.
Well, Senator, nobody wants you to get off the earth, obviously.
Oh, don't.
Nobody's trying to put you on a spot, really.
No.
Everyone appreciates the difficulty of your position.
The hottest places in hell, Bobby liked to say, quoting Dante, are reserved for those who, in a time of great moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. While Bobby hesitated, another liberal Democrat, Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy, picked up the sword that Kennedy was still refusing to wield.
I intend to enter the Democratic primaries in 4 states.
As McCarthy campaigned through New Hampshire that winter, Bobby watched with dismay and envy.
It hurt Kennedy that he was on the sidelines. More and more college students were not just going to McCarthy's campaign, but were starting to heckle him. I mean, he spoke at Brooklyn College one day, and it was a big sign, RFK, hawk, dove, or chicken. And that was a razor in his heart. He was really reeling around about what's the right thing to do.
But he did not see how it's practical to run. He took a poll in New Hampshire in January of that year that showed Johnson beating him there 67-9 or something like that. That was a pretty convincing argument.
At the end of January 1968, a miserable Robert Kennedy finally reached a decision. He would not, he told the National Press Club, oppose the president for the Democratic nomination under any foreseeable circumstances. That very same day, Vietnamese communists launched a series of attacks that made him bitterly regret his decision.
232 GIs killed and 900 wounded. Is just over 2 days, the past 2 days, 2 of the worst we have known in Vietnam.
The widespread fighting convinced many Americans that the war was far from over. Frustrated with the seemingly endless fighting, more and more turned away from Johnson to Eugene McCarthy.
The big surprise in the first primary of Campaign 68 has been the strength of Senator Eugene McCarthy. The volume with which New Hampshire's voters today endorsed his effort signals trouble for President Johnson's as yet undeclared re-election bid.
The president and his advisors are most concerned about what tonight's returns mean in terms of Bobby Kennedy. Will Gene McCarthy's showing be enough to tempt Kennedy into an open race for the Democratic nomination? We just don't know what Bobby will do, one of the president's closest friends said tonight, adding, and until we do know, we'll be wary.
As I say, maybe I'll have something further to say after I see the rest of the figures.
Would you
Thank
accept a draft, Senator?
I don't think anybody suggested that.
Well, I'm suggesting it now. Would you accept it?
I don't think that's a practical matter.
Would you refuse it?
Well, I just don't think. Will you accept one?
He retreats into a deep funk. He stops taking phone calls. He paces around his office. He won't talk to his aides. He goes back to Hickory Hill and seems to disappear for several days. What he's doing during this time, besides castigating himself for making such a mistake, is deciding that he's going to run for president. And when he emerges, he comes out swinging.
I am announcing today my candidacy for the presidency of the United States. I do not run for the presidency merely to oppose any man, but to propose new policies.
Jackie Kennedy was much concerned by Robert Kennedy's entry into the presidential contest. She said, I believe they're going to do the same thing to him that they did to Jack.
Kennedy's campaign in the state primaries was part politics, part crusade, part circus. In 15 days, he stormed through 16 states, with tens of thousands of people screaming his name.
My father was mobbed wherever he went. People were trying to touch him, trying to feel him, taking off his cufflinks, taking off his ties.
I'd like to announce that somebody's taking off my shoes.
Bob was at his best in that campaign. He touched people. He was speaking very directly to them. It was very heart to heart. He said he was doing it to save the soul of the country, and I believed him.
We can return government to the people. We can change this nation around. We can make a new effort for peace in Vietnam. We can improve the life and the quality of America here in the United States. I ask for your help. Am I going to receive your help?
When he first goes out on the stump, people go crazy. There's so much pent-up anger and frustration, and it's explosive when Bobby goes out there. He goes to the Midwest, you would think a bastion of conservatism, and he appears in the University of Kansas and Kansas State in these big field houses, and it's like the roof was blown off.
We get there, and the place is just, not only is it packed, not only is every seat packed, the entire floor is wall-to-wall people. And there are people sitting on the girders, practically hanging from the ceiling. And an unbelievable cacophony of noise.
18,000 white farm kids in this big basketball field house. He gives this powerful speech against the war, all out, finally, like he's like a tiger let out of the cage.
Our country is in danger, not just from foreign enemies, but above all from our own misguided policies. This war must be ended, and in my judgment, it can be ended. And it does not involve giving up, but it does involve not continuing to follow the bankrupt policy that we're following at the present time.
The stronger he gets, the louder the cheers. And I remember a photographer from Look magazine, he looks over and he yells at me, he says, "This is Kansas! This is Kansas! Kansas, he's going all the way!"
In spite of his wild popularity, Bobby knew he was fighting an uphill battle. The nomination was in the hands of the party bosses, mayors, governors, labor leaders, who would control the votes at the Democratic convention. "I have to win through the people," Kennedy told a reporter. "Otherwise, I'm not going to win." Then, on March 31st, 1968, he was taken by surprise, along with the rest of the nation.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
With no warning, a physically and emotionally exhausted president had put an end to the contest with Robert Kennedy just 15 days after it had begun. "I wonder," Bobby said, "if he would have done this if I hadn't come in." 4 days later, Bobby flew to Indianapolis for a campaign speech in a black neighborhood. En route, a reporter had told him that Martin Luther King had been murdered.
We were trying to pull together people for a mass rally for Bobby Kennedy. But there was some people saying that evening that maybe he shouldn't come because maybe there would be violence.
The police thought it was dangerous. They didn't want us to go in there, but he went. I scribbled something on a piece of paper because I knew he'd want to say something, but he had figured out what he was going to say. He had written it himself. We brought them the news that Martin Luther King had been shot.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
Most of the people hadn't even heard that Dr. King had been shot, and we were stunned, and we all cried. But that evening, Robert Kennedy spoke from his soul.
For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to go beyond these rather difficult times.
The words, they just ring, they'll just chill your body. And he did it not in a loud, but almost in a prayerful manner.
My favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God."
In our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our despair against our will comes wisdom through the awful grace of God.
There were riots in more than 100 cities across America after King's death. But that night, there was calm in Indianapolis. There was no way that Eugene McCarthy could inspire crowds the way Bobby Kennedy did. But he didn't seem to care. Cool and aloof, he appealed to white middle-class opponents of the war, especially college students, scornful of Kennedy's late entry into the race.
Bobby Kennedy had a natural affinity for students, and it pained him deeply when the best students often signed up with Gene McCarthy.
Robert Kennedy loved the McCarthy kids. He once said to me, "It drives me crazy that Gene gets all the A students and I get all the C students."
On election night, Indiana voters gave Bobby the victory he wanted, but not the knockout blow he needed.
This was his first face-to-face primary with McCarthy. He had to win it, and he did win it.
But winning Indiana was just the first inning of a 9-inning game.
A week later, Bobby proved that he could appeal to farmers, winning again, this time in Nebraska. Oregon was next.
The attention of the nation is going to be focused on the state of Oregon. You could very well determine who's going to be the next president of the United States.
But Oregon Democrats were mostly comfortable white suburban voters. They turned away from Bobby's campaign with its focus on race and poverty. For the first time ever, a Kennedy lost an election. "Let's face it," Bobby told a reporter, "I appeal best to people who have problems."
He was devastated by that loss. He said, if only we could have moved a ghetto up here for a day, we could have won this election.
It was not going to be the victory march that he had hoped for. He had to win California. He just absolutely had to win.
California was pure mayhem.
People treated him like he was some rock star. It was young people, it was blacks, white, Hispanic, just pulling for him.
It was the most emotional adulation I've ever seen in politics, particularly in the black and Mexican areas. The Sunday before the primary, he invited me to ride in his car going through Watts and East LA. He said to me, "I want you to see what I see." And I see this ecstasy in the eyes of blacks and Mexican Americans.
If we make the effort, if we have that love and friendship and understanding for our fellow citizens, we will have a new America. And you here in Watts, you here in Los Angeles and California, you will have made it possible, and I will work with all of you. Give me your help. Give me your help.
Not since Abraham Lincoln had a white politician been so embraced by people of color. "These are my people," he told an aide. "These are my people." On the final day of the campaign, Bobby and Ethel rode slowly through San Francisco's Chinatown. As usual, there were no armed bodyguards or Secret Service agents. "You've just got to give yourself to the people and to trust them," Bobby said. "And from then on, either luck is with you or it isn't." What sounded like shots turned out to be Chinese firecrackers. Bobby flinched, then went right on campaigning.
Robert Kennedy was fearless to the cusp of reckless. And I think there was some daring of death and fate in what he did.
On election night, there was only good news. Bobby got the victory he needed, with blacks and Hispanics voting for him in overwhelming numbers. The 1,500 volunteers jamming the ballroom at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles were ecstatic as they waited for Bobby to appear.
It's a lot of people there. There are a lot of people. And everybody, really having a wonderful time and getting ready for a terrific party that was going to take place later. This was really his win. Hadn't been done by staff, hadn't been done by all these people around him. He did it.
He had liberated himself from leaning on his brother's myth. He had found that inner voice.
"I feel now for the first time," Bobby told an aide, "that I've shaken off the shadow of my brother."
Thank you very much.
We watched him speaking from the ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel, and we all was feeling very, very good.
What I think is quite clear is that we can work together in the last analysis, and that what has been going on within the United States over the period of the last 3 years, the divisions, the violence, the disenchantment with our society, the divisions, whether it's between blacks and whites, between the poor and the more affluent, or between age groups, or on the war in Vietnam, that we can start to work together. We are a great country, and a selfish country, and a compassionate country. And I intend to make that my basis for running and over the period of next year. So, my thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
I left the suite on the 5th floor during RFK's acceptance speech and got into the ballroom just as he was leaving the podium. And he goes into the kitchen area, and then I hear this moan, this cry, this screams.
As Bobby had reached out to shake the hands of the men and women who worked in the kitchen, 24-year-old Saran fired a bullet into his brain.
Well, delirium broke loose, and I realized that he had been shot. And then people just went nuts. I saw people punch the walls, lie on the ground and weep. John Lewis and I just hugged each other and sobbed.
Dr. King, 2 months earlier, and now Robert Kennedy. It was just too much.
On June 6, 1968, Bobby died. Like his brother, less than 5 years before, Robert Kennedy passed on into legend. Two days after Bobby's death, his body was carried to Washington's Arlington Cemetery, accompanied by family and friends.
It was like an Irish wake. Everybody was in pain. Everybody was numb, in shock.
Just one long cortege of grief, hour after hour after hour.
And all along the way, you saw these unbelievable crowds carrying signs saying, "We love you, Bobby. Goodbye, Bobby."
You saw white faces and black faces and Latino and all the diversity of America. It was all there on the side of the tracks as the train went back to Washington.
It was quite remarkable, really, what Bobby Kennedy suddenly meant to the American people. And I say suddenly because it had happened in just a couple of years, really. I mean, it would have been laughable to think of Bobby Kennedy as a presidential candidate in 1961. And it certainly wasn't laughable in 1968.
He had the capacity to open up himself. We saw him grow. We saw him change.
He was 42 when he was killed. We'll never know, would he really have gotten us out of Vietnam? Would he have really dealt with poverty and racism? But he was cheated out of his chance to test his ideas and his values.
It seems to me that what we're doing when we mourn Robert Kennedy is mourning our own lost possibilities.
"30 yards from his brother's grave, Robert Kennedy was laid to rest. Carved on the marble gravestone are the words from Aeschylus that he could recite from memory. "He who learns must suffer, and even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart. And in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom to us, by the awful grace of God.
There's more about RFK at American Experience Online. Explore 1968 in a timeline with video clips. Find out more about Kennedy's enemies. And historians explore what might have been. All this and more at PBS Online, pbs.org. American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit.
At Liberty Mutual Insurance, we do everything we can to help prevent accidents and make America a safer place. Liberty Mutual is proud to support American Experience.
At the Scotts Company, we help make gardens more beautiful, lawns greener, trees taller. If there's a better business to be in, please let us know.
American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.